if big bad China gets it, we're all going to be enslaved.
If this sort of more doomsday scenario that you put on the table is correct, the consequences of China winning that race are so bad, are we really going to risk New York City? If we weren't cutting them off from NVIDIA chips, you wouldn't have this incentive to pour hundreds of billions of dollars into Huawei to create an alternative to NVIDIA.
What are those weapons that China can use against us?
China controls 99% of the supply. During that trade war where Trump had 145% tariffs on China for a few weeks, China got the U.S. to back down. They're all breathing a sigh of relief, saying, "Oh, well, the worst of the tariffs is over." This is actually something I think that the market is misreading now.
There's a lot of different elements of power. The U.S. has sort of been known as a military and economic powerhouse, I suppose, but you're taking a more maybe holistic look at power and different levers of power instead of just military and maybe, I don't know, the dollar itself, which we'll get into.
Yeah, no, that's totally right. I mean, what I'm looking at here in the book is America's asymmetric leverage in the global economy. The book title is Chokepoints. Historically speaking, when you think about a choke point, you're thinking about geographic features like the Bosphorus, which is this narrow strait that runs through the center of Istanbul, connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara and the Mediterranean beyond. In the news recently is the Strait of Hormuz, where you got 20% of global oil flows going through it every single day. And ever since the beginning of time, countries, empires that control these choke points have immense leverage because they can cut off their adversaries from them. Or, if you want to unseat an empire, cutting off their access to a choke point is a good way to do it. What's happened in the wake of hyperglobalization in the 1990s, when you have deep integration of financial markets, supply chains, it created these invisible choke points, like the dollar-based financial system, like semiconductor value chains, like energy supply chains, where in some cases, one country has a dominant position and there are few, if any, substitutes at all. And what that has done is, without having to go out and blockade the Strait of Hormuz, the US government can actually just cut off countries from access to the dollar or maritime insurance and impose just as much economic harm on them. And so what you've seen really in the last couple decades since the origination of these invisible choke points is the threshold for deploying really hard-hitting economic pain on other countries has gone way down. You don't need to deploy naval force to do it, but the impact of economic warfare has at the same time gone significantly up.
Yeah, so it sounds like, hey, good news. We don't need a Navy to do this blockade anymore. But it's also like, well, is that good news? Because if the U.S. is that good news for America? Because if the U.S. is the one with the Navy, let's say in this case, maybe we want the bar to be pretty high for someone to blockade something, but Iran can just say, yeah, we're just going to drop a bunch of sea mines in the Strait of Hormuz. Good luck transiting your oil and your products through there now. You're not going to get insurance to drive a big tanker ship through a mined strait. So this asymmetric warfare is dangerous for the big guys, which is us, essentially.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's like any other revolution in the use of power, right? One thing I'd probably compare the current age of economic warfare to and how economic warfare has changed since the beginning of the 21st century is the advent of air power on military force, right? Before you had airplanes, if you wanted to actually do harm to an enemy's cities, you had to actually put troops in harm's way, right? You had to, you were going to risk blood and treasure to do really anything significant. But then when you have an airplane, you can just fly over another country's cities or their industrial plant and bomb them and potentially inflict dramatic damage without really suffering anything yourself. And I think in some ways it's a moral hazard, right? It makes it easier to use military force. Because of these invisible choke points that really are created in the wake of hyperglobalization, you now have the same almost moral hazard with respect to economic warfare. And that's why, despite all the talk of Trump with unprecedented tariffs and everything, if you look at every single president, U.S. president in the 21st century, from Bush to Obama, to Trump, his first term, to Biden, now to Trump again, you've seen the imposition of sanctions and other weapons of economic warfare double with each administration. And so there's clearly this structural trend that's happening. It's because it's become almost irresistible. And what I'd also say is that other countries too, as you mentioned, have similar power. And we saw this recently when China, just by virtue of cutting off American companies from rare earth minerals, was able effectively to win the first chapter of the Trump-China trade war in the second term.
Yeah, I want to talk about rare earth metals in a moment because it was like, these are a huge deal. Nah, they're not a big deal. We have our own. But you can't mine them. I mean, it's just really got confusing really fast. These levers of power are interesting, but some people are going to say, hey, last I checked, we're still bombing bunkers in Iran with explosives. So why are we still using those levers when we have other easier, cheaper, safer levers that we can pull?
Yeah, look, I mean, in some ways, the military action that Israel and the U.S. took against Iran in recent weeks, it is a result of a failed bet by Donald Trump in 2018, because we had actually successfully got a nuclear deal with Iran, right? Between 2006, so between sort of the early years of George W. Bush's second term and 2015 in Obama's second term, the U.S. had successfully deployed really substantial economic leverage on Iran, leading to the rise of an Iranian government led by Hassan Rouhani in 2013 that explicitly wanted to negotiate away the nuclear program in exchange for economic relief. And there was a deal struck in 2015 that prevented Iran from having any high-enriched uranium. So right now, we're talking about these fears that there are 400 kilograms of Iranian high-enriched uranium where we don't even know where it is, right? Despite the fact that there have been these strikes. As of 2015, because of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, Iran had no high-enriched uranium, 0 kilograms, right? What Trump gambled in 2018 was that if he pulled out of the deal, he could impose what he called maximum pressure sanctions, basically even stronger sanctions than Bush and Obama had done, to get an even better nuclear deal, right? That was Trump's bet that he made in 2018. And by virtue of Israel's unilateral decision, I might add, to attack Iran's nuclear strikes in recent weeks that the U.S. eventually joined in on, that marked the final failure of that bet. I still posit that we would have been better off had we stayed in that nuclear deal and never pulled out of it. This restriction on Iran having high-enriched uranium wouldn't have expired until 2030, right? Wow. So, we would have had many more years, to potentially get this thing right. But look, I think what it shows is that economic warfare is powerful, but it's not a cure-all. You're not going to achieve maximalist objectives through sanctions alone.
Right. That makes sense to me. I don't know the ins and outs of that deal, so I think critics say, like, well, we don't know if they're abiding by it. I really don't know the finer points of that, so I'm going to stay out of that quagmire while people are they're already angrily typing the comments, so you guys can delete that and just continue to listen. But you're a former top State Department sanctions official, right? So you probably know. I'm curious, what do you think when people say things? So, well, sanctions against Iran didn't work. They're building a nuke. You kind of covered that. But what about sanctions against Russia? Those didn't work either. They're doing okay right now. The war effort is still going strong in Ukraine. They're in a wartime economy. Well, maybe sanctions don't work against Russia either. What do you think about that?
Look, I mean, sanctions and economic warfare overall, they're just a form of coercive statecraft, right? They're a way to try to build pressure on a foreign government to try to force them to do something that they otherwise wouldn't want to do. Generally speaking, I mean, this is true in life, just as it's true in diplomacy. Coercion is really challenging, right? And it's particularly challenging when you're going up against a foreign leader who's got control of a very powerful state, right? So, it's interesting because I, in addition to working at the State Department and Treasury on sanctions, I did a stint at the Pentagon too, where I worked for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And never once during my whole time at the Pentagon did I hear anyone say, well, does a bomb work? Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, a bomb works to blow things up, but it's pretty challenging to even to translate that damage into a political outcome that you seek. I think the same is true of economic warfare. Because of the choke points we talked about earlier, the U.S. does have really incredible power. I mean, single-handedly, we drove Iran's economy into a grievous recession in 2012, 2013 by virtue of our sanctions that largely were unilateral, right? And even in 2014, the first Russia sanctions, which weren't nearly as strong as the 2022 sanctions, where in 2014, we cut Russia off from capital markets. Basically, we prevented their big companies from raising debt on U.S. Markets. That did force Russia into a dramatic economic crisis in the winter of 2014, 2015. And I think, unfortunately, even though we had Russia on the ropes, it was leaders like Angela Merkel in Germany who were nervous about pushing Russia too far that then sought this Minsk agreement in February of 2015, I think prematurely backed away without trying to actually get Russia fully out of the Donbass. And that wound up being a big mistake in retrospect. So I think oftentimes we don't push economic warfare far enough really to get the outcomes that we want.
That's interesting. You think the sanctions don't go far enough. I mean, I think a lot of Americans probably who pay attention to this stuff agree with that. It's definitely really tough when you see the Europeans going soft on Russia, but I'm going to start on a rant here, and I'm going to try not to, but they're also dependent on Russian oil because of poor leadership and obviously failure to see the obvious future that even teenage me saw, or almost slightly past teenage me saw coming down the pipe, and thought, oh, well, what do I know? I'm a college freshman. This sounds like a bad idea, but I'll leave it to the experts. Well, here we are. Good job, experts. But the United States holds the most critical choke points today, right? Would you say that's accurate? We got the dollar as reserve currency. We've got the military power. We've got maybe semiconductor supremacy, I would say. I guess we technically must have that, right? I mean, yes, we work with Taiwan and Israel and those other countries on those things, but I would imagine China is racing to close the gap there. I don't think Russia's going to come up with a semiconductor industry anytime soon, but I know China is actually in the contention to close the gap on a lot of these. Maybe I should back up a second. What choke points are there right now that you're chiefly concerned about? We got military power. We're kind of maybe not talking about that particularly. What else are we? What's first in your mind as a choke point that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, so by far the most important choke point in the global economy today is the dollar. The dollar is this essential part of just the entire global economy. Sometimes we talk about the dollar as the world's reserve currency. It's because 60% of all foreign exchange reserves are in dollars. That's the money that central banks hold around the world. But I think even more importantly is looking at the dollar as the de facto and default medium of exchange for all global commerce. 90% of all foreign exchange transactions use the dollar, which is just remarkable because you have literally, just for scale, this is pretty wild, $7 trillion of foreign exchange transactions every single day.
Wow.
It's by far the biggest financial market because even when two countries are trading with each other that are not the US, like India and Saudi Arabia trading with each other, there's going to be multiple foreign exchange transactions to enable that trade to happen. And almost always the dollar is going to be part of it. So it'll be, the Indians taking their rupees and converting them to dollars, and then taking those dollars and converting them to Saudi riyals to pay the Saudis, right? Or vice versa. Because banks around the world, it's too complicated for them to hold large stocks of every currency they might encounter. Right. They're only going to have their home currency as well as the dollar, which is sort of this like neutral way station. And because of the dollar's essential role, that's what gives the U.S. government the ability to basically interdict transactions that seemingly have nothing to do with the United States. We talked about Iran, right? I mean, the key sanctions on Iran that drove them into a big recession in 2012, 2013 that led to the election of Rouhani and ultimately the Iran nuclear deal. They were unilateral U.S. sanctions that stopped China, that prevented China from buying as much Iranian oil as they wanted, and prevented India from buying as much Iranian oil as they wanted. And also, even more importantly, channeled payments from China to Iran into these escrow accounts. And the thing that's remarkable is we did that just by going to Chinese banks and threatening their access to the dollar, saying, if you don't comply with this, you will be cut off from the dollar.
Wow, yeah, that is quite potent. I mean, just the threat of it. I know we did something similar to North Korea a while back where they were moving money around, and I think, I can't remember the exact bank that it was, but basically somebody in the U.S. government was like, hey, we know you're handling millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars in North Korean money. If you keep doing that, you can't use the dollar anymore. So pick who your friend is. North Korea, which has an economy the size of, I don't know, Dayton, Ohio or something like that, or the entire free world. And the Chinese bank was basically like, well, the jig is up. Give the no-cos their money back and pretend we've been following the rules this whole time. Get your ass in line. Does that ring any bells? Does that sound familiar to you?
Of course. Yeah, no, I think I'm glad you brought this up because I think it helps illustrate in some ways what was like the foundational realization that enabled America to weaponize the dollar. It happens in 2005, September of 2005, when the Treasury Department, under this new division called the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, led by a lawyer named Stuart Levy, basically comes up with this novel idea, which is, maybe we can lead the global economy to de-risk from North Korea. They basically persuade banks of their own volition to cut ties with North Korea. All they did was they found one bank in Macau, there's a Chinese province, that was managing something like $25 million of North Korean money. It's not very much money, but
right.
That's what they were doing. And we declared them what's called a primary money laundering concern. This happened in September of 2005. And we assumed in the U.S. government that this might lead to this one bank really being isolated, maybe going under. And it did, by the way. This bank, Banco Delta Asia, did effectively go out of business very quickly, and it had to be rescued by the Chinese government. But even more importantly, it did lead to this cascading effect where even Chinese banks and other banks in the region started saying, wow, if I'm doing business with North Korea, maybe I'm going to be declared a primary money laundering concern by the U.S. government. Maybe I will be cut off from the dollar. And so what this sort of aha moment that officials like Stuart Levy and others in the U.S. government had is you could almost use the private sector's own risk calculus, their risk-benefit analysis that they're making, as a weapon. If you could change that calculus and make it seem, wow, it is really not worth the risk of touching any North Korean money because I might lose access to the dollar, which is effectively like a circulatory system for the entire international financial order. I'm not going to even risk being in business with North Korea in the first place.
Yeah, it's interesting, and this is definitely a weapon of warfare, because if you try to do something like that in the business environment inside the United States, for example, it's against the law in most cases to do that, right? I can't say, hey, I have a big show, but if you go on this other show, I am going to make sure that every other podcast never has you on. I mean, it's dodgy to do that, right? I could probably tell you that privately and you'd believe me, or maybe not. But if I wrote that down, you'd have a case for tortious interference, I would say. I mean, that might not be the best example, but
no, I think it is. But look, go back to ancient Greece. I mean, the biggest penalty you had in ancient Greece was ostracism. It was like being shunned by society. So right. I do think when you can use corporate self-interest to effectively ostracize entire foreign countries. And that's what initially was done to North Korea, and then even more effectively done to Iran in the lead up to the nuclear deal.
What about semiconductors? I know we mentioned this earlier. China's trying to develop theirs. We're constantly sanctioning the pieces and the equipment and all the materials they need for that. But I don't fully understand, why is this a choke point if no one else has it other than the United States and potentially China? Yeah,
totally. So look, it's hard mathematically to define what a choke point is, but one way I sort of do it in a crude back of the envelope way is the United States is 25% of global GDP, right? So if you look at any sector, you'd assume that they'd all average up, if you added them all up, to right around American market share is 25%, right? I just got over telling you that in the financial sector, the dollar is 90% of foreign exchange transactions. It's 60% of central bank reserves. It's in basically any metric you look at in the financial industry, the dollar is more than twice that baseline of 25% of global GDP, right? Semiconductors, if you look at that industry, the value chain, so this is all the value, all the profits in the entire semiconductor industry, 40% are generated by US companies. That's like NVIDIA, Applied Materials, AMD, Micron, which is kind of interesting because a lot of times when you think about semiconductors, a lot of people think about Taiwan, right? Because 90% of the fabrication is being done by this company TSMC in Taiwan. But in terms of value generation, most of it is coming from US companies. It's the key designs, the tools, the software you actually need to make advanced semiconductors. China is below 10%. The value is something like 5% that all Chinese companies are providing.
Oh, wow.
So this is a choke point. I'd say it's not as important of a choke point as the dollar, right? Mm-hmm. I just mentioned we had 90% of foreign exchange transactions. It's 40% of the semiconductor value chain, but still well above this baseline of 25% of global GDP. What's happening right now is because the U.S. has weaponized advanced semiconductors, our role specifically in designing advanced semiconductors vis-a-vis China, you've created an incentive in China to pour hundreds of billions of dollars into creating homegrown alternatives, right? So the key one right now is Huawei, right? Where Huawei has been sort of stood up as this domestic chip champion that may be able to challenge NVIDIA down the road. It's going to be hard. It's going to take some time. Will they get there? Possibly, but it's going to be very, very challenging. And I think at least over the next 5 to 10 years, this will be a significant source of leverage the U.S. has over China.
Interesting. Yeah, This one kind of scares me a little bit just because semiconductors are in everything and they can be used to make smart weapons and things like that. And of course, you need them for AI, which is, I assume, also a choke point. I don't want to get to that just now because probably people are salivating for that one. But you mentioned oil services, and this is one I think most people just never think about because you go, oh, Saudi has oil, Iran has oil, the U.S. has oil, Russia has oil. Okay, but you're not talking about oil. You're talking about oil, petroleum-related services, right? This is different.
Totally, exactly. So when you think about oil, right, there's oil that's in the ground, and that's sort of random. You're lucky if it's on your territory, right? But then what does it actually take to extract oil? You need exploration and production, right? You need companies that can actually explore for it. Those are companies like ExxonMobil or Total, the French company. And then when you're actually like trying to get as much oil as you possibly can out of the ground, oftentimes you need what are these oil field services companies. So some people have heard of SLB, or the company that was formerly known as Schlumberger, or Halliburton, that some people may remember because of Dick Cheney's association with it. Baker Hughes. These are companies basically that in every major oil field in the world are providing these proprietary tools and technologies to ensure that you can actually extract the oil from the ground, right? And then beyond that, once you actually have the oil, you have to get it to the marketplace. And so you need tankers, right? The tanker fleet is largely concentrated in Southern Europe. Many people have heard of Greek shipping magnates, right? Greece has been, ever since, again, ancient times, they've been a maritime power, right? They've got a big percentage of the maritime tanker fleet. Even more important, you need maritime insurance, right? You're shipping billions of dollars of oil, on these tankers. Sometimes if these tankers get an oil spill, they could create even more damage, and who's going to pay that out? So maritime insurance is an important sector, and that is almost entirely concentrated in the UK. London, is the home of something like 95% of all maritime insurance.
Yeah, this is
based
Lloyd's or whatever.
Yeah, the London, the P&I Club, International P&I Club. But Lloyd's is sort of one of the original members of that. And so, if you look across the oil supply chain, yes, most of much of the world's oil might be in Venezuela and Iran and Saudi Arabia. But really, if you actually want to get that oil out of the ground into the market, you need Western companies. And so that does wind up being a choke point.
This to me is interesting. I guess I just don't, this is a bit of a tangent, I suppose, but I just don't understand how Russia, which has nuclear weapons and a bunch of oil, also needs Western companies to come drill for that oil. Like, you guys have one massive economic driver. You think you would get a handle on this, right? Like, how is it that they aren't the masters of oil drilling and shipping?
Yeah, part of it really, it does go back to this 1990s hyperglobalization, right? It's a period when we didn't view, geopolitical competition as a relevant factor. We thought that economic interdependence was good because it brought efficiency. So if you were Russia, relying on ExxonMobil or Schlumberger didn't seem like a sense of vulnerability. You weren't fearing that one day the U.S. was going to tell ExxonMobil, you got to get out of Russia. Mm-hmm. And someone like Rex Tillerson, who some people may remember, CEO of ExxonMobil, who then becomes the Secretary of State in the first Trump administration, he basically makes his career doing business with Russia. Right. So, and by the way, the same is true of U.S. companies. There are U.S. companies who become entirely reliant on China for a variety of different things. So it's not just a one-way street. I think what has happened is we embraced deep and thorough economic interdependence in this sort of halcyon period of the 90s when we didn't view geopolitical competition as a relevant factor. But today we have intense geopolitical competition. Yeah. And so all of a sudden, these pieces of our economic reality that we just embrace because of efficiency's sake seem like vulnerabilities. And so could Russia develop best-in-class oil field services and a tanker fleet and maritime insurance? Yeah, perhaps. Is it going to take a decade or more? Yeah. And in that period between now and 10 or 20 years from now, there's a lot of pain that Russia could suffer from if they're cut off from Western services. Right.
And they seem to be focused on other things at the moment. So I don't know how much. You also need other experts. You would have to hire an army of consultants to come in and help you develop that, all of which you probably can't do when you're sanctioned into oblivion, right? Because if you can't work with Exxon, what you need to do is poach as many employees and experts from Exxon as you can, and none of those people want to move to Russia right now. And many of them probably can't even take the deposit on their services legally. So, okay, that's interesting. I always wondered that because I thought, how are you not like, hey, this is really important, we should get a handle on this? But you're right, if we develop this in the 90s. So it seems almost like Russia fell into the same trap as Europe, right? Europe said, we're going to be dependent on Russian oil, what could go wrong? And Russia said, we're going to be dependent on Western oil drilling companies, what could go wrong? And now that there's global competition, everyone's scratching their heads. But how is this not totally predictable at some level? This must just be the 2020 hindsight bias.
I think it is, because look, I try to be empathetic to, people who were making decisions in the 90s, right? And I think if you go back to that period, it really did feel like a world historical opportunity, right? The Soviet Union just dissolved, right? You had our rival superpower, the key authoritarian rival to the democratic America, who just commits suicide, right? They just say, we're no longer playing the game anymore. And in fact, we want to be your friend, right? And China was saying, we want to be your friend. And so I think it was a reasonable bet for leaders in the 90s to see if it was possible to actually globalize what had been a democratic international order that had only existed amongst advanced industrialized economies, right? I think where we erred was we didn't see that this wasn't working too as soon as it became obvious, right? Mm-hmm. You can go back to 2008. I know, Jordan, you've covered a lot of Russia issues over the years.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
2008, Russia invades Georgia, right? They use the military force to, recognize two breakaway republics in Georgia. In 2014, Russia invades Ukraine, annexes Crimea, right? There are sort of, clues along the way that this isn't working vis-a-vis Russia. We don't really fully decouple from Russia until 2022, right? I mean, it takes a while. And then with China, China, the writing sort of becomes, is on the wall by the 2010s, where you have just a series of cyber attacks on the U.S. You have the militarization of the South China Sea, an increasingly aggressive Chinese policy under Xi Jinping. But I think not only is it challenging for us to sort of accept that, maybe our policy of integration with China isn't working, but there's also then these very powerful vested business interests that say, we don't want to decouple from China. We rely on China. And so I think we didn't reverse course soon enough, as we should, but I do understand why we at least made that gamble in the 90s.
Yeah, and that makes sense. You're right. It's hard to put yourself in the mind of somebody in 1993 being like, this is the new world. Well, we could always go back to the way things. Well, that's not going to happen. I mean, it is tough, I suppose. But I still can't help but think if you have one economic driver, you should really have a handle on all of the things in the supply chain for that particular driver, especially if you are a country like Russia. But different world, man. So let's talk about artificial intelligence, because it seems like this either will be a new choke point or it's a bunch of hype and it's basically glorified Google and not really going to do anything yet. I don't know. But certainly in 10 or 20 years, this could be the new choke point, which maybe breeds other choke points because it's so smart and innovative. I don't know. What do you think?
I think so. Look, I mean, one quick thing before I dive into AI about choke points is they're not immutable, right? They come and go, right? Like, I just mentioned that, Russia is building their own ecosystem of energy services. They have amassed a shadow fleet to ship their oil without reliance on Greek tankers, right? They provided maritime insurance through sovereign guarantees, right? They're gradually sort of developing independence in the oil sector, right? So that choke point may be less salient 5 to 10 years from now, right? The same way that maybe the dollar winds up being a less salient choke point 10 years from now. But that doesn't mean there won't be choke points, right? New industries are created where there will be fresh choke points. We already see it in clean tech, right? In clean technology, whether it's solar panels or batteries or electric vehicles or rare earth minerals that are going into all these things, China's dominating. China holds all the choke points across that industry. In artificial intelligence, right now, if you had to bet, there will be very significant pieces of economic leverage, choke points, if you will, and most of them will be under American control. Because you have companies like OpenAI and Anthropic and Google who have just such a giant lead in this space, right? You also critically have the computing power that's going into creating these artificial intelligence algorithms and then running them, inference on them, that are largely based on NVIDIA chips, a company that is based not too far from where you're sitting right now, Jordan.
Down the road, yes, exactly.
So look, I think that There will be new choke points in the AI space. We're not exactly sure where they'll be. We're, I think, relatively confident that computing power will continue to be one, unless you just have total parity between the US and China, which, again, I think is unlikely. I think that there could be some in the models themselves, whether it's OpenAI just builds super intelligence first and they control it, and OpenAI is a US company, in which case, America wins the AI race. Even getting a 6-month lead on China by virtue of cutting them off from NVIDIA chips is probably worth it, right?
I agree. I think for people who are confused, basically, if you get to, the argument is, I should say, if you get to AGI, artificial general intelligence first, that intelligence is smart enough to go, hey, I'd be 100 times smarter if I had this, and this, and then you can build that for it, or it can build it itself, and it can say, I'm going to recode myself to be 10 times faster. I'm going to write a new programming language that humans can't read that makes this thing so much faster. I'm going to add a bunch of nodes. Hey, by the way, here's how you do quantum computing. So we go and build that with its help. And now it's 1,000 times faster. And then we say, hey, we just want to make sure that China doesn't get this. And it says, no problem. Anytime they're close, I'm going to put something in there that ruins it. And it's going to take them a year to figure it out. And it's just going to do that forever. And then until it can't, and then it's going to say, if you blast this thing, they're going to be set back by 3 months. This is where they're working on all this stuff. I can tell by the internet traffic. And they're just never going to be no one's ever going to be able to do anything without the permission from this AGI basically ever again. And it's going to be constantly evolving to make itself smarter, better, and faster every minute of the day, most likely. So that's the sort of terrifying potential conclusion here, ... we all get made into paper clips or whatever the horror story is. But we want to get there first because theoretically, arguably, debatably, if the free world gets there first, we can harness it for the power of good, as we always do with all of our technology, folks, right? But if big bad China gets it, we're all going to be enslaved. And I kind of personally think some of that might be true, but I think largely we're all getting made into paper clips. So what do you think? I don't know. Where are you with this?
I'm glad you brought this up, because I think some people ask me, is it a good thing that we are cutting off China from advanced chips? Because all it is encouraging them to create an alternative, right? If we weren't cutting them off from NVIDIA chips, they would all be using NVIDIA chips. You wouldn't have this incentive to pour hundreds of billions of dollars into Huawei to create an alternative to NVIDIA. And in fact, Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, that's his argument. He says, we're foregoing a $50 billion a year revenue opportunity because we're not selling to China. And he's trying to get Trump right now to lift the export controls so that we can sell NVIDIA chips to China. The thing, and the reason I think it's important to bring this up and to have humility is if we aren't in a race to AGI, if artificial intelligence is just like any other technology where there's not going to be an endpoint, and there's going to be, we're going to incrementally get better, and it's going to, maybe change our economy quite a bit, but it's not actually going to be super intelligence, then probably Jensen Huang's argument is correct, where we'd be better off just allowing this technology to diffuse in China, to make them dependent on it, and not to worry too much about whether we have a 6-month or 12-month lead, right?
Right.
However, if this sort of more doomsday scenario that you put on the table is correct, and there are people who are very deep in the AI space who believe that we actually are moving toward AGI, then having even a 1-month lead on China is worth it, right? Because if we get there first, then we kind of win, right? We get the brass ring. So I think it's one of these policies where it's almost impossible to know whether it's the right thing to do. You just sort of have to kind of play out the worst case scenarios. And I think probably the consequence, if it is true that we're in a race to AGI, the consequences of China winning that race are so bad that it's worth it for us to do these export controls. So generally speaking, I support the export controls, even though I'm somewhat agnostic on the question of whether or not we actually are in this existential race with China.
I'm not enough of an AI expert to really know about this. I just know what a lot of experts say to do, but they don't all agree with each other. So it's okay, fine. I'll let the adults in the room kind of handle that one. You're right though. There is probably a balance where it's well, we can let NVIDIA sell them the 5 nanometer chips, but we can't let them have the 3 nanometer or the 1 nanometer, wherever we are now, 1 nanometer. So they're going to invest a little, but the pressure for the market is really off because they can still make smartphones, toys, gadgets, computers, and everything else. And they can invest in the national security cutting edge part, but it's but we're never making that money back because Nvidia is just going to innovate something else. So if we can keep them like permanently 6 months or 1 year behind us, just on the super ultra high end stuff, maybe that's how we keep them in tow. And then we create AGI and we're like, all right, screw it. Now it's a different game entirely. But that's something that I just don't know how you juggle that. But so basically you can use choke points. You don't have to completely choke everybody off using this, right? You can let in, just like you could through the Bosphorus, you can let in what you want, and you can keep out what you don't. That seems like a really delicate dance that really smart people are working on. I know that's something that you have worked on with, the Iran, kind of the different sanctions deals and things like that you note in your bio here. Russia's not going to close the gap on semiconductors anytime soon, I assume. They don't make anything like that, correct?
Yeah, Russia is totally out of the game. And they have been, by the way, forever. I mean, this is another thing that's interesting. The Soviets, the Russians, after them, they have this great legacy of science, right? But for whatever reason, this is an area where they just haven't been able to keep up.
Yeah, that's probably a separate book about just all the things that need to be in place in an economy in order to do something like this. But it's interesting because you would think all of those things had to be in place to launch Sputnik and get it to the moon. Like this national drive where everybody, air quotes, everybody is on the same page scientifically. Semiconductors are kind of like the space race in that way. And the Soviets were the first ones to go to space. They did a lot of first things in space. And then when semiconductors came around, they were just like, well, we got Tetris and we're tapping out. All right, thank you. I remember vaguely in the 90s, they tried to copy a computer that I think was made by Tandy. And it came out and it was just 3 years behind everything when it came out and was like super expensive and not good for the time. And that was kind of their only sort of wheezing attempt at making anything like that. And that was the end. I don't know. Very strange. I guess it just shows you the decay that happens when a society like that, a government like that is too corrupt to really get their shit together, I guess. I don't know. Speaking of getting your shit together, what do we think about the U.S. and Europe maybe standing apart from one another? Because we've always kind of been, well, since World War II, with Western Europe, right? These were our guys. We were together. We were rowing in the same direction. Now it seems like under the Trump administration, we're kind of split. There's China, Russia, the authoritarian-led, I use the word axis, but I don't like it because it's loaded, but whatever, bloc. And then we have the United States and Europe, but it's kind of just now the United States and then also Europe.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that this is something that has been in the works now for quite some time. During most of the Cold War period, and we've been talking about the Soviets, if you look at the original purpose of NATO, right, it was to keep the Soviets out, the Americans in, and the Germans down, right? And part of that will help explain to you why we have this sort of legacy situation in NATO where the Europeans are fully dependent on the United States. We wanted America to have military hegemony in Europe, right? We didn't want Germany and France and all these countries to rearm the way that they were after World War II. It's the same with Japan, right? I mean, the original sort of bargain was, we're going to take care of defense. You guys focus on the welfare state. But what's happened over time is we no longer like that bargain here in the United States. We want Europe to arm itself. So there's a desire in the U.S., as you saw with the recent NATO summit, to get the Europeans to shoulder more of the burden when it comes to military force. In Europe, I think at the same time, especially after Trump was reelected, they're concerned that in a serious scenario where Russia were to threaten them militarily, that the U.S. may not come to their aid, right? If Russia were to invade, Lithuania or something like that, are we really going to risk New York City on account of Vilnius? Maybe not, right? And so that uncertainty in Europe right now, I think, is causing real political movements, and especially in frontline states, to start investing significantly more resources in defense. And even in Germany now, the current chancellor, Friedrich Merz, is very committed to investing in defense equipment. When it comes to economic warfare, the topic of my book, Chokepoints, one of the big challenges is that, when the U.S. is acting alone on economic warfare, when we're just imposing sanctions or tariffs by ourselves, it can have quite a bit of impact. But what it does is it creates this generalized incentive to hedge. And when you can find an alternative to the dollar by just going to the euro, it's actually not that painful, right? Because the euro is a convertible currency. It's quite useful. You can use the euro for a lot of different things. You're not worried about, your investments in Europe being expropriated. The same way if you were investing in China, you might be worried about getting your money out of China.
Yeah.
And so what we've seen so far in the last few months, as the Trump administration has taken a more unilateral approach to economic warfare, right, imposing sanctions and tariffs just by ourselves, we have actually seen this interesting strengthening and rise of the euro, right? And so I think from just a sheer American interest standpoint, we're better off, generally speaking, applying economic warfare, fighting economic wars with coalitions, specifically with the Europeans, the Japanese, the Brits, issuers of other major reserve currencies. Because if we act alone, we really do, wind up weakening our own choke point leverage that we have around the world.
I see. Right. Because if the Europeans are like, well, you can just use the euro. All right. Sure. Or the yen. Fine. But if you can't use the yen, you can't use the euro, and you can't use the dollar, well, okay. The alternatives are not looking so good. We'll get to the BRICs thing in a moment here, but I'm curious why you wrote in the book onshoring, and I'm paraphrasing here, onshoring, friend-shoring, and moves towards economic self-sufficiency will bring benefits, but also increase the risk of armed conflict. First of all, what is friend-shoring? I don't think I've ever heard that before. I just copied it from the book.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So maybe it's quickly onshoring would be, okay, instead of getting our widgets from China, we're going to start getting our widgets from Alabama, right? We're gonna take jobs that had been outsourced, that had been offshored, and then onshore them, bring them home to the United States, right? Friend-shoring would be, okay, we're comfortable having other countries involved in our supply chain, but only if they're our friends, right?
Okay.
We're cool relying on oil from Canada, but we're not necessarily cool relying on rare earth minerals from China, right? It's basically having a more alliance-based approach to economic activity.
I see.
This is what we had, by the way, during the Cold War, right?
That's
During
what
the
I was
Cold
going to say. Yeah,
Yeah.
Europe wasn't buying a bunch of Russian oil because, geez, those are kind of the bad guys. We're not gonna get mixed up in that. We don't want to give them billions of dollars a week, right? So it just doesn't make any sense. So why does this increase the risk of armed conflict? Is that because with dependence we can't afford to be bombing each other, but if we're making it all at home, it's just one less thing to worry about?
Yeah, I mean, my own view is that if we truly were to invest in friend-shoring, this idea of truly building, a new economic order that didn't have as much dependence on China, had virtually no dependence on Russia or countries like Iran that are very clearly our adversaries, I think we actually could get to a place where the world is more stable because we wouldn't feel super vulnerable to China, right? Because the only way they would be able to threaten us would be really through military force. It wouldn't be through cutting off our access to key minerals or resources or batteries, right? The area where I'm more concerned about the risk of armed conflict is if we do exclusively focus on onshoring, if we move towards something like autarky. Because there are voices in our political system today who say, well, we can't rely on Canada either. We can't rely on Europe. We don't want our automobiles to be made with any European or Mexican parts or Canadian parts. We want every single part that goes into the Ford F-150, from the steel to the valves to the engine, every single piece to be made in the United States.
Wow.
That kind of view of autarky, first of all, I think is very, very challenging and hard to do. I think would be very expensive. But the thing I worry about most as someone who, appreciates history, that view of autarky is historically something that leads to imperialism and conquest. Because you just think about it, if you don't feel confident that you can secure the resources you need through trade, through buying them, if you don't think you can get the minerals you need from Greenland by just like buying them from Greenland or cutting a trade deal with Denmark, then you might want to go seize those resources. You might want to go plant the American flag in those icebergs and take those minerals.
It's funny you should mention Greenland because that's exactly where I was going. I was going to say, so what are we going to do? So does it turn out that we do need Greenland's mineral resources? So maybe that, because when I heard that, I was like, why are we even talking about this? It's just out of left field. Do we think, by the way, you think the Greenland thing is coming back once the dust around Israel and Iran and whatever settles? You think he's going to pop that thing back into the news cycle?
I don't think it's going away. Yeah, I mean, I think, look, autarky is a mentality, right? If your mentality is, we don't have access to this unless we own it, right? And by the way, this cuts through Trump's approach to Canada too, where he says, well, you want free trade with us, you could become the 51st state, right? You can become part of the United States, right? This is a view that has recurred throughout history, whereas
Yeah.
you can't trust anybody. And by the way, they're probably this type of mentality might work in certain business sectors, right? Maybe in the cutthroat world of New York real estate, maybe this helps you. I don't know. But I think that view, at least historically, does incentivize imperialism and conquest, right? And probably the best illustration of it, if you go the most infamous leader who had this view was Hitler, right? Where his view was you needed all of the resources of Central and Eastern Europe under German domination. You had to actually control, Ukraine and parts of the Soviet Union. You had to control, Czechoslovakia to have the Skoda works, their big military production facilities. That if you didn't control them, you couldn't rely on the materials from there.
Right.
And that was the whole idea of Lebensraum, right?
I'm sort of sympathetic to the argument that you need more space to do more things. It's the whole murdering millions of people part that I didn't really get behind with the World War II thing. Lebensraum, but also the whole mass murder thing didn't sit right with me and still doesn't. I get it though. I mean, it's scary because, you're giving the example of Hitler, which is usually like, okay, once you're starting to talk about Nazis, you're way out of the park. But it's kind of a good example, which is a little scary when it's actually fitting. You mentioned Canada as the 51st state. I was gonna make a joke that every Canadian I know wants to become part of America, but I think it doesn't. Everyone just stops listening and immediately emails me something angry in all caps. So I won't make that particular jab. I think it's scary to make those kinds of comments. I think sane people take them as a joke. Many other people don't. It worries me that we are going down this road potentially. Like maybe it starts with Greenland, but then it's not going to stop with Greenland, right? Not that it's okay to take Greenland either. By the way, YouTube commenters.
Yeah, look, I mean, and again, I'm not necessarily even worried that this is something that's going to happen next year under Trump. I'm saying that autarky as an organizing principle, if that's something that we believe in the United States and, that China believes and Russia believes, that does incentivize imperialism and conquest, right? And you could even argue that that's a potentially a negative externality of some of our export controls on China to loop the conversation back, right? We have effectively, the US government, pressured TSMC, the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and told them that they cannot sell high-end chips to China, right? The chips themselves are made in Taiwan.
Right.
And we've said, if you sell those chips to Huawei, we are going to cut you off from, the tools that you need to run your fabs in Taiwan, right? Well, maybe that could wind up incentivizing China to seize Taiwan, right? There are negative externalities to our actions too, right? Hitler or the Nazis don't have to be your example. It could be, Imperial Japan, right? The U.S. cut Japan off from various commodities, including oil, which incentivized Japanese imperialism and incentivized them to seize oil fields throughout Southeast Asia. It incentivized them to attack the United States at Pearl Harbor, right? So you have to be worried when you're engaging in this kind of high-end economic warfare, when you're creating an incentive for autarky, that it could bleed into military force.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. This is a potentially unrelated, but it is also choke point relevant. Why, if we are trying to get Russia's economy dented even more during this war, during this conflict, why don't we just encourage the Saudis to dump oil into the market like crazy? And why don't we dump? I mean, the U.S. produces a ton of oil. Am I just not able to do the math? Can't the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and other allies of the United States just dump oil onto the market ridiculously cheap and totally screw Russia? Because their economy is oil dependent. What am I missing?
Yeah, so the U.S. doesn't quite have that capability because we don't have really any spare capacity. We're producing as much oil as we possibly can, right?
Okay, I didn't know that.
Saudi Arabia and some of the other OPEC member states, but mainly Saudi, has significant spare capacity where they could actually pump a lot more oil just based on a political decision, right? The Saudis, and this is the whole point of the OPEC cartel, right? They restrain the amount of oil that they pump because they don't want oil prices to crash, right? They prefer to produce a little bit less oil but make more money per barrel, right? But let's say, Trump was successful in getting the Saudis to pump more oil. And by the way, no president has ever been successful at that. Like we've tried. We tried, in the Obama administration tried to get the Saudis to pump more oil to try to punish Iran's economy because the Iranians were also dependent on oil sales. Right. And even though the Saudis at the time wanted regime change in Iran. I think the Saudi king said, please cut off the head of the snake.
Yes.
They weren't willing to pump more oil. They're very resistant to these geopolitical purposes of their oil sales. But so far, during the second Trump administration, Trump has actually seen some success in getting the Saudis to pump more. And the Saudis have gradually ramped up their oil sales. But yeah, I mean, theoretically, if the Saudis were game to like really crash Russia's economy, they could do it. I think the problem we would have here in the United States, let's say oil went to $20 a barrel, right? Or something.
What is it now?
Extreme. Right now it's in the mid 60s, which is actually quite remarkable given that we still have we're just fresh off an active war in Iran. And threats to close the Strait of Hormuz, and mid 60s is pretty low. Let's say oil crashed, to the $20 or $30 a barrel, extremely low level, right? It would completely bankrupt Russia, right? It would be terrible for Russia, right?
Yeah, and Iran, right? Like, isn't this the most epic win ever for Saudi Arabia?
It would be awesome.
Yeah.
At the same time, though, it would also bankrupt American shale producers. And so you'd have bankruptcies throughout the Gulf Coast, and Louisiana and Texas, my home state of Pennsylvania. And so in some ways, because now the U.S. is a net oil exporter, we don't want oil prices to be that low, right? Because it would actually be, it would put out of business some of the very oil producers that we rely on right now.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there could be some kind of solution to that somehow, but it would be extremely expensive, right? You'd basically have to float the shale producers in the United States for however much time it took, years, to bankrupt Iran or just to make a big dent in Iran and Russia. Although, man, if that's what we have to do instead of having a nuclear standoff, I'm kind of here for it, man. I don't know.
Me too. I'm game. And look, I think this is something that's super important because, sanctions, economic warfare take a lot of heat. People are like, well, wouldn't we be better off through, development assistance and peace rather than economic war? But like the reality is the alternative to economic war often isn't peace. It's actually real war, right? And that's what we've seen right now with Iran. Like we tried, Trump tried from 2018 to try to use maximum pressure sanctions to try to get a better nuclear deal than we got in 2015, right? That failed. And then the result is actual war, a real nuclear crisis with Iran. So my own view is we should be willing to risk quite a bit to make economic warfare succeed against the likes of Russia and Iran because the alternative is worse. With Russia, I think the way you could plausibly do it, instead of just getting the Saudis to, pump 2 million more barrels of oil and tanking oil prices, what I would do is I think you could gradually start taking Russian oil off the market. So let's say you remove, 20, 30, 40% of Russian oil sales from the market with the use of sanctions, basically threatening buyers of Russian oil, like the Indian refineries or the traders in Dubai, and saying, if you're buying Russian oil, we're going to cut you off from the dollar. Most of them then would stop buying Russian oil.
Sure.
So you take 20, 30, 40%, right? You take supply off the marketplace, price goes up. What happens when price goes up? The shale producers in the U.S. all of a sudden have an incentive to pump more. And so they invest more and more in production, right? And the Saudis all of a sudden have an incentive to, produce, allow some of their spare capacity on the market to take advantage of those higher prices. So my own view is the way that this would work is for a few months, you would get higher oil prices. But quickly, that the supply would rise to meet demand, and the supply would be coming from the Gulf Coast and from Saudi instead of from Russia. So I think that's the best way. Is you basically bring the close the walls in and on Russia, be willing to take some short-term pain, and realize that it's going to be American producers and other Gulf producers that are going to take the share away from Russia.
Any guesses why we haven't done that yet? Just because the short-term pain, or do you think we're deliberately bleeding Russia out in the fields of Ukraine?
It's sheer political fear, first by President Biden and now by President Trump, about higher oil prices.
Yeah,
there is a petrified, especially Biden. In 2022, go back to the beginning of the war, the big war in Ukraine. You had oil prices over $100 a barrel, so way higher than they are now. And you had inflation at a 4-decade high, highest that it had been since the 1970s, right? It was something like 7% or something. So yeah, Biden was petrified that even a short-term spike in oil prices would worsen inflation, would rise prices at the pump, and would kill the Democrats' political support. And now, by the way, Trump is worried. Trump's tariffs, by the way, have an inflationary impact, right? Because tariffs are a tax on imports, so everything's going to be more expensive. Trump has been trying to mitigate that by lowering oil prices, right? So if oil prices go up and then you just have runaway inflation, Trump's worried that his popularity will evaporate. So in America, we've basically shown that we just don't have tolerance politically for higher oil prices.
What about China's weapons? I assume that we talked a lot about American choke points and levers we have, but it seems like China has either deliberately or just through the fact that we make everything there, created its own arsenal of what appear to be potent economic weapons, and they seem prepared to use them in retaliation. But what are those weapons that China can use against us?
Well, I think you're just to say right off the bat, you're 100% right. Like in 2018, when Trump started the first trade war against China with the original tariffs and export controls on ZTE, the telecommunications equipment maker, and eventually on Huawei, China was totally caught unaware. They did not think that this was going to happen. So they didn't have an economic arsenal. They hadn't figured out what choke points they could weaponize against the US or any other country. But that was, 7 years ago. And they have now built this fulsome economic arsenal that actually looks quite a bit like the US. I mean, in some cases, it's almost humorous. In the US, our export control list is the entity list. In China, they have the unreliable entity list, right? It's like they effectively copy pasted like a variety of our tools, right?
Okay.
The actual choke points they have at their disposal, the most important ones really run across rare earth minerals that are used in everything from these high performance magnets that you need for automobiles in the US, critical minerals that you need in everything from batteries to ammunition and missiles and fighter planes that we use in the US, and then across the clean energy supply chain. So batteries themselves, China completely dominates. And one of the best examples here, the leading drone company in the US, a company called Skydio, which is also based in Silicon Valley, was sanctioned by China a few months ago. And all of a sudden, just after those sanctions, they told all of their customers, thousands of customers, that every customer only got one battery per drone. So if you think about it, you're using a drone for an industrial use case, or the Ukrainians are using these drones to document war crimes or surveil, Russian positions, and you got one battery. I mean, it really decreases the utility, right? So this shows that the chokehold China has over that space. And then even electric vehicles themselves. I mean, China now is by far the world's leading auto producer. They're by far the leader in electric vehicles. And literally companies like BYD, the leading Chinese automaker, making cars that are more efficient, better than a Tesla, and way cheaper. We were worried, the US, during the Biden years, that if these cars were allowed in the US market, they would just completely put Tesla, GM, et cetera, out of business. And so the Biden administration actually imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles to keep them out of the American market. So China does have these choke points. They have the legal machinery now to use them by sort of copy pasting a lot of the laws that we had in the US. And just a few months ago, during that trade war where Trump had 145% tariffs on China for a few weeks, China got the US to back down. They got Trump to capitulate by virtue of imposing export controls on those rare earths, by cutting off US access to those rare earths. And all of a sudden, you had Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, go to Switzerland and agree to basically back down.
Yeah, the rare earth thing, it's quite frightening because apparently even though we have them, we can't really get them out of the ground, and it would take like 15 years or something to develop that capacity, and even that might be optimistic. And other people will say, oh, no, it's not that. It's that you have to pollute the crap out of everything around it in order to get these out, right? You basically have to totally destroy the area. I don't know which part of that is true, but basically we're not willing to do this, and we're also partially not able to do this in the United States in a way that's clean and sustainable and quick.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's kind of interesting about rare earths, and I think it helps actually elucidate this concept of choke points, is like the entire rare earths industry globally is quite small. It's not like the hundreds of millions or single digit billions, right? It's like nothing, right? It's like a rounding error, right?
Okay.
But the reason it's so potent is because China controls 99% of the supply of various ones, right? They're refining 99% of some of these key rare earth minerals. And so even if it's not that much when it comes to revenue, if you're relying on, one of these rare earth minerals from China to, build your car in Detroit, and you're cut off and you can't make your car without that mineral, even if it's not a big expense for you, you still can't make your car, right? And they can shut down industries in the US. And so what it shows is that choke points isn't just about like economic weight, right? It's not just like we're so strong, we're huge, we can hurt you. It's about asymmetric leverage. It's about areas where there's really one country has this dominant position and there are very few substitutes. Look, over time, anything can be substituted, right? You could invest money and time and resources and be willing to pollute, parts of the United States to develop our own supply chain. You could use, I think, more intelligently friendshoring, right? Developing supplies in places like Ukraine or Greenland or, Australia, and buying those minerals from more reliable sources than China, right? Or it could be a diversity of countries. Any of those solutions is going to take time, right? At the very least, a number of years. And so the Chinese have realized that they have this sword of Damocles that hangs over big parts of American industry. And to be sure, they are going to leverage that time and time again in the years to come.
All right, just a quick break. I'm going to tell you about something that'll actually make your life easier. If you're thinking about starting a business or you already have one and maybe logo or branding design is not your strong suit, you're going to love Design.com. With Design.com, creating a standout logo is as easy as it gets. You just pop in your business name and your industry, and in seconds, you're going to get thousands of custom logos to choose from. Every design is handcrafted by top designers and exclusive to Design.com, so you're getting something unique. Once you find a design that you like, you can customize the fonts, the colors, the layouts to make it yours. Then you download all those assets and you're good to go. And Design.com doesn't just stop at logos. They've got tools to help you create all of your branding materials, from website to social media posts to business cards, all perfectly aligned with your brand. If you already have a logo, you can upload it and you get instant access to thousands of design templates that actually match your brand's look and your color scheme. So this tool saves you a lot of time. It lets you focus on growing your business instead of getting stuck in the weeds with marketing materials. With a 4.8 star Trustpilot rating, Design.com is legit amazing. It's run by a friend of mine. The company's been around for a while. They really do care about their customers. Try it for free at design.com/Jordan. That's design.com/Jordan. All right, everybody, this video is brought to you by HVMN, and it is worth hearing about, especially if you're looking for appetite suppression. You ever try fasting, then your stomach starts planning a mutiny around hour 14? Enter Ketone IQ from HVMN. It is a great tool for appetite control and clean energy. It helps suppress ghrelin, that's your hunger hormone. It helps boost leptin, your fullness signal, so you feel satisfied even without food. Plus, it gives your brain and body clean fuel without breaking your fast. So you're still in ketosis, you're still burning fat just without the hanger. It's like telling your cravings, not right now or not today. Fasting is hard. HVMN makes it a whole lot easier. Try Ketone IQ. Go to hvmn.com. Enter promo code Jordan for 20% off Ketone IQ. I want to, before we wrap, I want to talk about the BRICs idea of this alternative bloc. We hear a lot about it. People online talk about it constantly. Oh, BRICs is coming. You guys are screwed. But I had Juan Zarate on the show, episode 863, former deputy national security advisor under, I believe it was George Bush. And he was basically like, there's no stinking chance that this works out for various reasons. The countries involved can't really agree on much. Their values aren't aligned. That many of them manipulate their currency or have just trash economies. Like South Africa is not really exactly a global power. Mostly there's just a whole basket of reasons why it's not possible. But I don't know. Never's a long time. What do you think?
Look, I think the BRICs as a coalition has always been tenuous. And you even see it now. I mean, the BRICs are getting ready for their annual summit that's happening in Brazil this year. Xi Jinping has said he's not attending. So the key member is not attending.
Okay.
And then Putin came out and said he's not attending because he's worried that Brazil might follow through on this International Criminal Court arrest warrant and actually arrest Putin if he goes to Brazil. So that just goes to show there are key geopolitical differences between the likes of China and Brazil, or even China and India, right, are deep rivals, and they're both in the BRICs. At the same time, there is one thing I think that all of the members of the BRICs agree on, and that is that they do not want to be dependent on the dollar. They do not want America to have this choke point, which is the financial system, that it can weaponize against them. And so I think the one area of cooperation where I do think the BRICs are going to make headway in the next 5 to 10 years is on building workarounds to the dollar-based financial system. China, by the way, already has. They have this mechanism called mBridge, which effectively enables clearing cross-border payments using central bank digital currencies. They pioneered it with the central banks of Thailand and the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And it wouldn't surprise me if the rest of the BRICs come in and join that in the years to come. And that poses a real threat to the main choke point that the U.S. uses for economic warfare.
So, but that replaces what? The SWIFT system for banking? It doesn't replace the dollar as a reserve currency, right? Or am I not getting it?
Yeah. So look, I think one of the challenges about currencies is they play various functions, right? So the three key functions that any currency plays is a store of value. So it's a place for you to invest your money, et cetera. A unit of account. It's like the prices are set in this currency. And a medium of exchange, right? When I buy something from you, I'm paying you in a specific currency, right? In terms of the dollar as a store of value, it's going to be really, really hard to unseat that
Yeah.
in any sort of reasonable time frame, just because the best companies are in the U.S., the best investments are in the U.S. We've got the biggest bond market, we've got the biggest equity market. But when it comes to medium of exchange, this is just payments, right? I mean, that is almost like infrastructure, right? Who cares what currency you're using? You just want it to work, right? You just want it to be predictable. And that is actually the function that the U.S. has used for economic warfare. It's being able to say, India and Saudi Arabia, you cannot do business with each other because you have to use the dollar, and we can actually just say, we don't want you to do that transaction, right? That's what we did to stop China from buying Iranian oil or stop India from paying Iran for its oil, right? We threaten their access to the dollar. I think when it comes to medium of exchange, this payment function, I do think there's going to be a disruption, a technological disruption that occurs over the next 5 to 10 years, which leverages things like central bank digital currencies and stablecoins to evade the current correspondent banking system, which is this New York-based foreign exchange system that is used to clear cross-border payments today.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Do you think, and I'm going rapid fire here because we're coming close to the time, but do you think the United States is going to back off their NATO commitments? I mean, it seems like Europe could start to distance itself from the U.S. militarily. Are we seeing this play out? Or, I mean, this could also change tomorrow because, that's kind of how this has been working lately. But what do you think?
I do think that Europe is going to play a more independent role in its own security. In an ideal way, this would be done through the EU, where you'd actually have like significant unified defense. At the same time, you've never very few people have won bets by saying the EU is going to get their act together in recent years. So I think probably the likeliest outcome is a coalition of European states like Poland, the Baltic states, ideally Germany, countries that actually, Sweden and Finland and Norway, countries that feel very exposed to Russian aggression will spend a lot more on defense, will integrate their defenses more. And I think what that'll do is it won't necessarily force the Americans out of Europe. It'll just reduce America's footprint on the European continent.
Do you think that we are going to continue to slam tariffs on key EU countries like Germany? Because I could see that forcing the EU to split into an independent political or geopolitical bloc or economic bloc. That wouldn't be great either, probably.
I think so long as Trump is in the White House, yes. I think that we are never getting past peak tariff. This is actually something I think that the market is misreading now. I think they sort of viewed like they're all breathing a sigh of relief saying, oh, well, the worst of the tariffs is over. We backed down against China. The EU may or may not get tariffed. I think that, Trump loves tariffs the same way that I love Radiohead. I decided they were my favorite band in high school and they're still my favorite band, 25 years later or whatever. That's how it works for Trump. He loves tariffs and he's going to keep using these tariffs. And he also, by the way, doesn't view the Europeans as owing any sort of, special relationship with the U.S. So I do think he's going to keep slamming them with tariffs. And I think it is going to both incentivize the Europeans to do more defense, but I think in the more negative side of the ledger, it'll also encourage the Europeans to hedge against the U.S. and build closer relationships with China and other countries that we don't want them to build relationships with. Yeah,
so then we might be pushing them towards China as well. Yep, well, that's the karma police coming for us on this one, I guess.
Good reference.
Yeah. That's probably the only Radiohead song I could probably name, actually. You've said tariffs are a slow burn. What does that mean in terms of long-term pricing? What are we not seeing now that you think might become obvious later?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the biggest problem with respect to Trump's tariffs is that he's ascribed so many different goals for them. He wants them to raise government revenue. He wants them to incentivize onshoring, protect strategic industries. But he also wants to use them as this like all-purpose weapon of economic warfare, where he can use tariffs to like get Mexico to like beef up its border security, right? Or get China to like crack down on fentanyl or, whatever. And I think the challenge is when you're using tariffs as a tool of economic warfare, they're inherently temporary. You have to say, okay, well, you've now acceded to my demands and I'm going to lift those tariffs, right? But if you're trying to use tariffs to incentivize onshoring, they've got to be permanent, right? Businesses are not going to onshore, spend the money to onshore their supply chains if they think that the policy is going to be reversed a year from now.
Yeah, so that's right, because they got to build a whole factory and a whole supply chain. Yeah.
So I think the biggest downside of Trump's tariffs is just the uncertainty that they cause for businesses. And they sort of like have this paralysis effect. And so I think what is effectively going to happen is you're just going to have slower economic growth, less investment. And I don't know if we're necessarily going to fall into a recession this year, but I think growth will be significantly slower than it is otherwise.
What sectors of the economy do you think are most vulnerable to long-term, is the term inflation from these tariffs, even if the average person maybe doesn't feel it yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think the average person will feel. I mean, inflation inherently is about prices, so people will feel it. I mean, it's any supply chain where it's heavily exposed to international inputs, right? So things like the auto supply chain, right, that's where the U.S. Really was, I mean, very at risk of potentially almost coming to a halt if China didn't kind of pull back its export controls on rare earth minerals, which I'll say, by virtue of the agreement they came to with the U.S. a few months ago, they only agreed to issue licenses for 6 months. So this issue is coming back, toward the end of this year. So I think you'll see, various prices go up. But I think the real concern, like I said, is a lack of investment, which then slows hiring, and maybe you get, either unemployment or at least, people who are attrition unemployment, which can be just as bad.
There's a narrative that tariffs help, protect American jobs. Is there truth to that, or is that economic smoke and mirrors?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that tariffs can play a role in protecting strategic sectors, right? So I mentioned that the U.S. imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles because there was a fear that if they entered the market, they would wipe out Tesla and GM and Ford. And by the way, I kind of support that because I think that it's probably important for us to have our own electric vehicle manufacturing, right?
Definitely.
I think the challenge is when you start doing tariffs on areas that aren't as sophisticated, even just like, commodities like steel, right? Well, you put a tariff on steel, so maybe you have some more steel production in the US, but then the automakers in the US who are reliant on steel have to pay a higher price. And so it's bad for them. And maybe you wind up hurting downstream manufacturers who actually, have better paying jobs, have more strategic industries. So I think you have to be very targeted. Another area where I think tariffs actually do play a good role potentially is pharmaceuticals, right? Where we have become way too dependent on active pharmaceutical ingredients from places like China. That is just not a secure position for us to be in, So I think that having some level of tariff, plus I think critically industrial policy, where you're channeling investment into things like generic drug manufacturing and in the United States, is a very wise policy if we can get to that.
Yeah, that's scary. I didn't even think about the pharmaceuticals thing. That is, that's a tough one. That's an icky one as well, because not having medication is... it's scary to think about, right? It's kind of like not having oil. I mean, it's really up there with that, or semiconductors. Yikes, I didn't even think about that. I know we're running out of time. This is really interesting, man. I really appreciate it. I rarely read something where I hope that most of the things in the book never happen, but here we are. But give us a reason to be hopeful and optimistic if you can, because the book is not all doom and gloom. I'm kidding.
That's right. Look, I mean, I think economic warfare, when done correctly, is an alternative to military force, right? It's a way to solve the hardest global problems without putting American lives on the line, right? Without risking Armageddon, And so one of the things I hope people take away from this book, and a real reason why I wrote the book in the first place, is we are living in an age of economic warfare. Sanctions, tariffs, export controls, they are just the primary way that great powers compete today, and they will be for a long time to come. And so it's essential for us in the United States and around the world to up our game, to learn more about these topics, to be able to weigh in productively in the democratic process. Because if we're not fighting and winning economic wars, we're going to be drawn into shooting wars. And I'd rather be fighting economic wars than being in shooting wars.
Yeah, that's a really good and unique takeaway that I had not thought of, right? So next time you see somebody with an end the sanctions sign, you tell them, yeah, end the sanctions. I'd rather be bombing the crap out of these people instead, and see how they react, because that's probably not what they're thinking, right? But that's the alternative in many ways. It's really interesting. I'd never thought about that. Eddie Fishman, thank you so much for coming on, man. I appreciate it.
Jordan, it was my pleasure.